is Wednesday, right?
It is Wednesday.
September 16th, 2015. And we're here with William Hugus, or Bill as he's better known. Bill, thank you.
Only I'm called William when I'm in trouble by my mother.
William? I like that. When did you, tell us a little bit about your background. Where are you from and how did you wind up in German Village?
I'm originally from Findlay, Ohio, born and raised. I went to school at OU in Athens for 3 years and finished my education at University of Kentucky, Lexington.
Oh, really?
2.5 years there. I also studied in Venice for a semester in their European study program, and after graduation ended up moving back to Findlay. The process with licensing is that you have to work for at least 3 years for a licensed architect or engineer in order to qualify to take the state boards. And so I got a job in Findlay and focused in on that. Didn't really want to live in Findlay, but it was comfortable and I could pay off my student loans. So
I have heard, especially from a close friend's daughter who just went through architecture school, that it is very demanding and much more demanding, I guess, at least these days, in terms of what the professors and the teachers expect of you than just about anything else. It sounds like going to medical school with the amount of intensity that's involved there.
it's very intense and it's very time consuming. The studio part of the program is very intensive, and for the credit hours you get per class, you put in 3 times the hours of a normal class. So it's definitely, it's good training.
So how did you wind up in Columbus and German Village then?
Interesting. I actually discovered German Village quite by accident. My firm that I was working for in Findlay had a large banking client that was based out of Findlay. They had just purchased a bank here in Columbus called Railroad Savings and Loan. And they had asked me in 1983 to come down to Columbus to look at a couple branches to renovate them. And in doing so, I needed a place to stay, and they offered the corporate apartment, which happened to be in German Village. Prior to that, I'd really never heard about German Village. Really didn't know much about Columbus in general. And lo and behold, the apartment is what is now called Starbucks, or was called, or no, I'm sorry, it was called Cup of Joe. And that was a branch bank, Railroad Savings, with an executive apartment above it. And I got to stay in that apartment.
Did you redesign the front of that building and come up with a facade?
I did not. I did not work on that building.
All right.
I was just merely staying there because it was a free place to stay, owned by the executive that owned the bank. And he used it primarily for OSU games to come down and stay. Stayed there, went to my meetings up in Arlington and Beachwald, and just was totally surprised by the scale of German Village and just fell in love with it.
And this was, you said, about 83?
83. Then I had been licensed recently then, and my firm had made an offer to purchase an architectural firm in Upper Arlington. And I was antsy to get out of Findlay and had basically told them, either you transfer me to Columbus or I leave the firm. And they transferred me here. So my first trip down to look for an apartment was traveling down City Park, and lo and behold, I run into an apartment for rent, and who's out in front of the apartment is Jerry Glick.
Of course.
Collar up, doing gardening. I stopped him and inquired out of my car, and he had said, "I'm so sorry, it just got rented a few hours ago." And I'd indicated, well, gee, if I'd love to see it just in case something happens. And he showed me through it. I fell in love with it. 2 weeks later, he calls me out of the blue and says, well, it didn't go through. Are you still interested? And I said, absolutely.
This was when Jerry was doing a little bit of real estate work, is that right?
No, he actually lived at the house on City Park, and this was an apartment above his house.
Oh, okay. You remember the address?
721, I believe. 719 and 721.
Very nice. So that was in '83. Now you're working.
Well, that was in '84.
I'm sorry, the next year.
Yes.
And now you're working for a different company, one that's based in Ohio or
Yes,
in Columbus.
in Columbus and actually in Upper Arlington, so I did the reverse commute. I lived downtown and commuted out to Upper Arlington every morning.
So the traffic wasn't quite as bad that way.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So which two branches of Railroad Savings did you work on?
One up on West Henderson Road and one up in Beachwald area on North High Street.
What happened to Railroad Savings? They were gone by the time Jan and I got here in '92.
I believe they were bought out by a company called Diamond Savings and Loan, and then that company was bought out by Chase Bank.
Okay. So they just got folded into other companies. Because I know for a while there was a Railroad Savings, like you said, where Starbucks was.
Yes.
Where Cup of Joe was. Where
Cup of
Tops
Joe.
is now.
Mm-hmm.
And it had been a framing company with just a smooth front on it, and a facade was.
Yes, the back section was a art framing company.
Yeah, yeah.
The front section, where the original Cup of Joe was the branch bank.
Just stucco-like or something.
Just stucco, and the facade was there. I did nothing to that building at all.
Yeah. And then I think for a while, it might have been the same branch that worked out of the little building across the street from Max and Irma's, that little office building.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it might have been there before it moved further up.
That could have been.
So how did you get involved with, say, your own company, and then particularly how did you get involved with houses here in the village?
Mm-hmm. Well, quite a few years later, within the company I worked for in Upper Arlington, which was commercially based, I did mostly university and bank work. I ended up managing 5 other architects in the office, but I was head of design. And the senior partner, I was a junior partner at that point, and the senior partner was going through his second divorce. And I had mistakenly discovered that he was draining the company of assets because of that divorce. And I decided at that point to basically just leave the company. I had enough of it. I could tell that there was really nothing for me here to buy from him when he was ready to retire. So I pretty much quit cold turkey.
And became William Hugus Architects.
I did after about a month of sitting around watching too much TV, eating bonbons, and getting completely bored out of my skull. One of my neighbors had asked, well, I need to add on to my house. Could you do that? And I indicated, well, I've never done residential, but I don't know why not. Let's look at it and see what I could do. And before you knew it, I was doing residential.
So your very first residential projects were here in the village?
Yes.
That's interesting. How many do you think you've done from 83, 84 until now, 2015? How many do you think you've been involved with?
Oh, that's a tough one.
100?
Probably more than 300.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I probably should do a count.
And you've done 3 or 4 at least new builds, haven't you?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The 2 that Andrea and Brett Camburn had on Beck.
Correct.
And then Dr. Bill Main's house on Deschler.
Correct.
The
And
house there
the
across
Ciprianos on Deschler.
Okay, I didn't know about that one.
That one's further west of Dr. Main's house, the next block, middle of the block.
Okay, with the cement looking.
The cement looking,
Correct.
which was originally supposed to be cut stone,
Hmm.
but she cheapened it.
Oh.
That was a disappointing project.
Well, now that Jim Reese is there, maybe he would like to
Yes.
retrofit that.
And I've been discussing that with Jim and his partner, and there are lots of ideas to help that house.
Would you rather build a house from the lot up, or would you rather go in and do a renovation?
I like both. Certainly the challenge of an urban lot is interesting to me, but it's also kind of a puzzle renovating a house and adding on, and I love that solving that puzzle part of it. What I found out basically that I really don't like working in suburbia where there's an ultra clean slate and there's really nothing to help me identify the direction of what should happen. I really like being in the urban atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Huh. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we've got the commission, which has been around since 1960, and for better or for worse, they have kept the neighborhood on track as a historic district and have prohibited a lot of really awful things from happening here in the village. And I say for better or for worse because I know there are always a few conflicts with the commission.
There are.
How do you work with the commission? Tell me a little bit about that process and what makes it work and what doesn't make it work for other people.
Well, I think the good part of that process really is the fact that there's 7 diverse people from different backgrounds on this body, and they rotate their appointments so that it's an ever-changing body, and their charge is interpreting what are the written guidelines, which were really not devised by that body, but a separate body charged with writing up the legal guidelines. And with every body, there's a difference of opinion on the direction that one should go. But I think overall, the product is a much stronger product when you have that diverse opinion for that body. And it's just a matter of negotiating what you want out of it and what my client wants out of it for this commission. And yes, there's some negatives, and you don't always get what you want. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I've been involved with some projects that clients have really been strong-willed about what they want and pursue that with the commission, and even though the commission approved it, looking back, there have been a few misfires. But that's part of the learning curve with any commission, and hopefully we've learned from those things and moved on.
I know there have been over the years some very long-term members and long-term chair people of the board, but there have also been excuse me, several who've been on for a couple of years and moved on to something else. Is there any kind of issue with consistency from, say, 1984 to 1990 to 2000?
Of course. Views change over time. The rules get tweaked over time legally. And each person that reads those guidelines will interpret them slightly differently. And that's just part of the process. It's kind of an organic process in that way, that it does change. They purposely made the guidelines loose enough for interpretation and flexibility to some degree. So that can cause some consternation with clients because they see a project that had previously been done and want to maybe copy some of those ideas, but maybe it's not appropriate to the new context of whatever we're dealing with. And the commission usually can identify that. And so it appears to be inconsistencies by the commission, but the reality is it's probably a site context more importantly than inconsistency with interpretation of the rules. And it is frustrating for myself as well as my clients, but I think it's an important part of the process. You know, it's kind of like democracy. It's messy.
What I've heard in general about what the commission does, because I have a house, we haven't done any major work to it, so I don't know any of this firsthand, but the commission in general wants any kinds of additions to not overwhelm the original structure, excuse me, not help cover the complete lot. They want 30 or 40% empty for landscape or hardscape. And then I guess the trickiest thing for me is understanding the commission doesn't want you to copy any of the old, but they also don't want you to do anything ultra modern. They just want you to make sure that it fits and it doesn't look like the original. How do you interpret something like that, if I've interpreted it correctly?
You're close. Well, first of all, there are city zoning guidelines for lot area coverage of building versus no building. I hesitate to say green space versus building, but technically zoning code only governs the amount of structure on a specific lot. And the commission has to follow those guidelines, of course, because that's part of the city code. So that's one factor. The second factor is they don't want the additions to overwhelm the original building, specifically the cottage building type, which is unique to this area. And we have had some misfires in the past over some too big of additions to the cottages. But the current thinking, nationally as well as locally, is that the new additions should read as a more modern interpretation of what's been here. That doesn't mean it has to be ultra contemporary, but they want it to be clearly read by lay people as not historic. The current thinking is that if you try to mimic or copy the historic, that it's taking away from the historic nature of the original structures. So the struggle with all these projects is how far do you go? How far do you take that? Part of it is depending on where the addition occurs to the original house. If it's behind it, there's more leeway to go more contemporary as compared to if it's beside it. And beside it would tell us that we have to tame things down, simplify the original historic fabric, but not take it too far contemporary.
Tell me about your first renovation down here.
My first renovation...
I understand it might have been the house that the Peppers are now in?
That was my first major house renovation in the village. And the Peppers had evidently found out about me through her hairdresser, who also cut my hair, interestingly enough.
And was this 84, 85? Something?
This was, no, it was more like 89.
Okay. So in that time period, you were doing smaller projects?
No, I was still working for my company in Upper
primarily
Arlington.
outside the village then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you went in, and I can't picture the house right now, but I understand it was quite a renovation.
It was.
Tell me a little bit about it.
It was a former fiberglass parts factory on Lozelle Street in an area of Lozelle that was kind of industrial historically. And it was a textured block, one-story structure that went the full depth of the lot. And once it became available, the Peppers purchased it and hired me to design to turn it into a residence. And to me, I believe it was the first of its kind in the village, specifically something industrial going to residential, I believe.
So you looked at this property and you said, this is like nothing I've ever done before, and I don't really know the commission that well, I guess.
Correct. It was interesting to deal with the commissioners and getting the clients to let me know what they wanted out of it. They have a little more contemporary bent on their appearance factor, And so it was a nice challenge. It was a nice challenge. It became really, because the factory was not, it was not a brick building like most of German Village. It was a concrete block building. So it looked industrial. And so in trying to keep that industrial feel on the main floor and adding a second level that was brand new became the biggest challenge. And it was fun. It was fun.
But it was considered a historic structure, even though it was just a concrete block building.
Correct. Correct.
So it wasn't going
It was
to
an
come down.
example of its time. It just wasn't the earliest example of an industrial German Village structure.
So you get finished with that project, and what's the reaction to it, and how did that affect you and your business?
Well, I think it was generally a good reaction. Funny that during the construction process, after the design was developed and approved by commission, my clients went to California. She had to visit her elderly aunt, and they came back from California loving all white houses because of evidently the clear, crisp blue sky in California. They became convinced that the house had to be and stay all white. The original factory building was white painted concrete block. And the second level was done in a cedar shake. And we primed it white, and they came back and saw it all white and convinced themselves that that had to stay white. My intentions were never to have it all white. I wanted to have a softer color to make it blend a little more into the landscape, because its forms were pretty contemporary for the time. Looking back now, they're not as contemporary as we would do today, but
And it's remained white.
it's remained white, and they've remained in the residence.
And I assume they were very happy with it for you to then get this ball rolling with your company down here and doing more
Yes.
and more major renovations.
And that
You said
really
300.
started the ball rolling for my company, and that's when I decided to actually give it a name and a presence.
And then,
So.
then everybody started coming.
Then it just started snowballing from there. Yeah.
Who have been some of your the other architects who are prominent down here in the village with their work besides you?
Historically, one of the early ones was Al Unetic, and who was a friend of mine, and then Jonathan Barnes early on, because his parents had lived down here. I'm not sure. I think Jonathan and Jenny, his wife, lived here briefly.
They did. In this bungalow next door.
Okay, and he was an early influence.
Do you think, was there a time when you could look at a house and say that's a Jonathan Barnes house, or that's a Bill Hugus house, or that's an Al Unetic house?
I think some structures can be identified in that manner. A lot of them can't, but definitely a few of mine can. I mean, I do strive to make sure that my clients' desires and personality come out in their house. I don't want it to look like a completely William Hugus architect's house, but I want people to recognize that there was somebody else involved besides my client. So it's always a challenge to balance that out.
How has your view on what the new architecture should look like down here changed since you moved into the village? Have you remained pretty consistent, or have your thoughts changed, maybe grown over the past 30 years?
My thoughts have always been that we should allow more contemporary additions to the buildings from day one, but the market clearly hadn't accepted that for many years. I see in the last 3 or 4 years maybe because of a younger clientele coming into the area, there's more acceptance for a contemporary bent. And I think nationally that's happening in a lot of historic districts as well.
You've done, you said 300 or more. Are you getting tired of it?
Absolutely not.
I thought you were going to end with absolutely.
Absolutely, you can edit that.
Not.
There are times when I get tired of seeing brick everywhere, and I do get out of the area quite a bit. I'm quite active in Upper Arlington currently, and I've done stuff in Westerville, up on Lake Erie, back in Findlay, my hometown. But overall, I think I'm not tired of it, no.
Good. Well, I want to shift gears now because part of this interview is about you and your work and just the tremendous influence you've had professionally here in the village with those 300 or more houses. But also, we're talking about these days about gay pioneers and the fact that this was a neighborhood that early on in the 60s, at least as a restored neighborhood, was very gay friendly. And you're a gay man. Had you
Yes.
been out when you came here?
Yes, I was out. I've always pretty much been quietly out, I would call it. But yes, that was the other bonus of German Village. I really had not known how accepting generally the population was here, coming from a small town in Findlay, but that was definitely an added bonus.
I assume Findlay being a much smaller town, you didn't feel quite the freedom that you do here.
No, not at all. And I got to meet a lot of very, very nice people here that I think have influenced me.
How so?
Primarily how accepting people are of pretty much all walks of life here. And politically, I see a wide range of gays in politics, both Republican and Democrat. And before, I thought maybe it's only should be Democrat, and I see that there's room for gay Republicans as well. So politically, it's opened my eyes, and socially, it's just there's a certain level of comfort that is promoted here. Just to be yourself.
I was talking with Steve Schellebarger a week or two ago about this very thing, and something that occurred to me that we had not asked any other gay men was possibly, was the neighborhood a little more accepting because there were fewer families down here? It's been an adult neighborhood for so many years, and therefore maybe not quite as many fears or prejudices as there would be if there had been a lot of children in the community. Not that there should be, of course. But.
And I think so. I think that is correct. I think that was one of the early influences. It was definitely in the 60s and 70s an urban pioneer aspect here that I kind of fell into in the 80s. Steve was one of those people and was an early friend. He was also, I met him through the Peppers, my very first big house. And he was very politically active, which influenced me to be part of that. Not in a leading role. I'm much more comfortable in a background role.
What was the atmosphere like for the gay community then? You moved here at a time when AIDS was really taking a stronghold on the gay community and probably raising some fears that should not have been there in the first place. But can you talk a little bit about that, moving here in the age of that fear of HIV and AIDS?
Well, it certainly was a scary time. And I think overall people were still accepting down here of us. but a lot of us were very afraid, to be frank. And I've had a lot of friends die.
Have you seen any prejudices down here? I'm sorry. Have you seen any prejudices down here that maybe you wouldn't see in other parts of, you see in other parts of town?
I think you always find pockets of prejudice. I didn't see anything generally throughout the neighborhood at all, no.
Were there any isolated incidences of maybe being refused to be waited on or knowing of something?
Well, there were incidents for me of walking down the street and a carload of people shouting something at us, things like that, but nothing specifically aimed at physically harming me or anything like that, no.
Now, what about your business and the fact that you were out, and this is still fairly early. I mean, gay rights have come a long way in the past 30 years. Did it affect your business in any way?
I never let it, because I was always very out, and I decided that my clients really have no choice. They want me for my abilities, and I was a matter of fact about it, and I never made a big deal about it, but I would never hit it either, which I think made people comfortable with it.
I think.
Does that make sense?
I believe so, and it prompted another question. I think in the past, perhaps the gay community was a little more insular.
Yes.
And perhaps, and I don't want to be putting words into your mouth, it was a little bit more open down here because of various factors, and it just continued to be a little bit more comfortable for everybody.
I think it did. I think it did. And I was never making it a point that I was gay. I was an architect. You were to hire me for my expertise, and that was kind of a side fact. It just was an overall normalness about it. Same way as when I approached my family about it early on. It was just, I didn't make a big deal about it, and they accepted it. So.
And in a way, it's kind of odd to even be asking these questions because of how far we've come. And
correct.
And
at some point, it's almost like there shouldn't be a need to even discuss it because it's normalized.
Yeah, and that's when you'll find yourself truly
correct
with equal rights, full equal rights.
Correct. Yes. Overall, I felt very fortunate to find an area like German Village to live in, and not intending to work in it, but to work in it.
Have you ever lived outside the village then since you've been here?
Not since I've been in Columbus. Well, I take that back. For 1 year, after I sold my first house and before I bought my second house, I rented a room from a good friend of mine who lived on King Avenue near campus. And that was an interesting year. That was way back when that was still a pretty rough area because it was south of campus.
Yeah, I bet.
But short of that, I've never left the village. It's been the longest I've lived as an adult anywhere.
I didn't hear the term gayborhood until a few years ago, and I still think it's kind of an odd term, but I suppose if you want to use that terminology, it was largely a gayborhood in the earlier days, and then I suppose gays became more accepted in other parts of town as they just became more accepted in general. And could you speak to a little bit of that and how it's not quite the concentration down here that it was?
Well, to me, it's not the concentration nearly that it was. It's definitely gotten normalized here. Part of that is due to the gentrification of the area. As houses get renovated, prices go up, less people, especially gay people, can afford the higher prices. So we tend to move on to other areas, and I think gays like to fix things. And so we've hit other areas. Of course, the short north was an early area that was hit, but there have been other areas like Old Town East, and I think currently Franklinton is an area that's going to be up and coming, and you'll see a lot of younger gays and artists moving into those areas. It's just part of the process.
It's going to be interesting to see Franklinton over the next 20 years.
Oh, yes, yes.
Do you see yourself getting involved over there professionally?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I have visions of actually retiring eventually.
Oh, okay.
Exactly when is everybody's guess at this point, but hopefully in the near future.
I want to ask you a question that I've never heard a really good answer for, and maybe there is no answer, and that is, why have we had men who are gay down here, but it has never been really known as a neighborhood for a concentration of gay women?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea? Excuse me.
I'm not sure I have an answer for that, other than gay men have been financially more able to handle some of the prices and the construction down here, the costs involved, and gay women have not in general. I think that is changing, but I think early in the gay history, that was probably more the case than not. I also think women back then didn't take on the construction projects that gay men have. I think in the construction industry, it's very male dominated. It still is, unfortunately, but it certainly has transitioned into more women involved.
You're pretty much touching on the same things that Steve Schellebarger did, and I think his point, or at least one of his points, was in general men have more money, have had more power in the past, have had the more freedom to come into a neighborhood like this and do those things. They
Yes.
might have been able to go to the bank and get a loan where a woman might not have been able to, not because of sexual orientation, but because of gender.
Yes, fair or not fair, that was probably more of a reality then. That's correct. Hopefully that's not a reality today.
Well, one last question to that is, where do you see German Village 10, 20, 30 years from now?
Continuing on its process of progress. I think the Livingston Avenue corridor being redeveloped eventually with the highway changes that are going to be occurring in the next 6 or 7 years could be a big influence. It could be really another more commercially concentrated corridor for German Village and have some opportunities there. And I think the improvements along High Street and Brewery District will also influence German Village. I think it'll remain a strong residential community with interspersed commercial activity, which is a wonderful mix.
Do you fear that with the gentrification comes maybe people with enough money that they're not so interested in community spirit or volunteerism or playing a bigger role in the community? Do you see
Yes,
the fear of that?
I do have a fear of that. Sometimes too much money spoils things, both in buildings and in people. And I think it's important that the society continue their efforts to keep people involved.